Greetings. So this is part of our makeup for our last Saturday class where we were having trouble. So we're going to cover chapter 2 and construction worksite safety. So this will be recorded and posted, and you can watch it at your convenience. Thank you for your time. Chapter 2, I'm going to share my screen. I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment. What the heck am I trying to do? And now I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you can see the PowerPoint. This is from Modern Carpentry, your textbook, and we will go through this briefly. So chapter 2 deals with safety specifically. So we have some objectives in the book. Explain what OSHA is. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Agency. It's been around since about 1970. We'll be talking a little bit about housekeeping. It's important to keep a job site clean to minimize, in particular, trips and falls and stepping on rusty nails and similar types of issues. We're going to talk about PPE, or the safety clothing as it applies to carpenters in particular, but construction folks in general. And then there may be some other PPE that you need to be aware of in order to work safely on a job site. Again, the reason we're wearing PPE or protective equipment is because a job site is a dangerous place to be, and there are lots of different ways to injure yourself. We'll talk a little bit about shoring and scaffolding, dealing with hand-empowered tools. Generally, we have electricity on the job site. That's also a source of many injuries. Injuries that arise from improper lifting or carrying. And then fire is also not uncommon on a construction site. So about 20% of all the fatalities in industry are construction related, and because of that, construction is considered to be a hazardous occupation. The big four in terms of construction worker deaths are falls, electrocutions, struck by object, and caught in between. So we will talk a bit about all of those. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I think I called it agency, but administration, is a federal agency, and it's designed to protect workers, develop standards for workplace safety, provide health information and training, and also inspect workplaces, either on as a response to a significant workplace accident, or somebody has been concerned about conditions within the workplace, and OSHA may be called in to make an inspection. So OSHA gives the states the opportunity to adopt their own program that is as stringent or more stringent than the federal program. So in California, we have Cal OSHA, that's under the Department of Industrial Relations, and our requirements are probably a little bit more stringent than federal OSHA. There are some states that use the federal OSHA standards. So you have a map. This is out of your book. So you can see in the dark blue, these are states that have an OSHA approved state plan that covers both private and state and local government workplaces. You also see the ones in the light blue, and those are the federal OSHA states. So you can see that primarily they're in the center part of the country, but California is one of those states that has elected to adopt their own plan that OSHA has reviewed and approved. And so the state of California administers construction safety requirements on construction sites and in the general workplace. So as a worker, you're subject to two different sets of OSHA or Cal OSHA requirements. One are the general safety orders that apply to everybody. And then there are specific construction safety orders that apply for people working in construction. Also, if you're working in agriculture, that's another high hazard occupation. And so again, they have their own separate set of additional regulations over and above the general safety orders. So the employers have responsibility under OSHA. So sometimes they call that the be a supervisor, go to jail rule in California. But the employer has a responsibility to provide a safe workplace, or at least as safe as is reasonable. If there are known hazards, the employer has to provide some sort of mitigation to reduce the risk to the workers. So the employer is also required to follow OSHA safety and health standards. It's supposed to try and eliminate or reduce hazards to employees and the public. And they're required to employ a competent person to enforce safety standards for certain types of work. So excavation, scaffolding are two examples where an OSHA competent person is typically required. So the workers, as a worker, you also have responsibilities under OSHA, and primary one is that while the employer is required to provide you with training, you're required to pay attention to that training and work in a safe and responsible manner according to OSHA. So there's a workplace poster that's required to be placed in a prominent location on a job site or in the office. And as a worker, you're supposed to be familiar with that poster. You're supposed to follow the safety and health rules. Your employer can go above and beyond what Cal OSHA requires, but they can't do any less. You're required to follow safe work practices. And if you notice a hazard, you have a duty to report that hazard to your employer. Now this is the poster. It's too small to read, but I will post a copy of this to Canvas. Now, what we're trying to do is develop or be a part of a safety culture when we're doing construction work. And supposedly, if you have a good safety culture, the workers are going to watch for potential hazards and take action to eliminate them, use proper safety equipment, perform the task safely. And again, in a good safety culture, employers are supposed to provide safety training. That training, in most cases, needs to be documented. They're required to provide equipment and materials to perform the work safely. And they're supposed to consider safety when planning the work. So before you start working, you should be looking at issues related to safety. And my goal for any construction practices class is that during the course of the class, no one gets injured due to anything that they're doing as part of the class. So general safety rules I've mentioned. And so safety is based on knowledge, skill, and the proper attitude. You need to be familiar with potential hazards, which may not always be obvious to everybody. And then you need to take some steps to minimize or eliminate hazards. My experience with injuries and accidents on job sites, usually there's one or more factors that are present, but things that will usually make it worse are things like being tired, not feeling well, being in a hurry, trying to go too fast. And so those seem to contribute greatly to the likelihood of an unfortunate event happening. So good housekeeping is important on a site. So not just from an OSHA standpoint, but the current requirements for stormwater also require you keeping the site as clean as possible. Trash and material is supposed to go into bins or dumpsters. Those bins or dumpsters are supposed to be covered at the end of the day, keep rainwater out. But again, if you have loose material scattered about the site, those become trip hazards. They can hide nails and other objects that you might trip over, injure yourself on. And it doesn't look very well either. So it does not, a dirty work site does not inspire a lot of confidence. So this is out of your book. I'm just telling you some tips. Remove nails from lumber scraps before discarding them. At the very least, you should pound them over so they're not sticking out. You should also know when your most recent tetanus shot was, because if you somehow step on a rusty nail, which is not uncommon on a construction site, then typically you're required to go in and either verify that you had your tetanus shot recently enough, which I believe currently is every 10 years, or you have to get a new one. So tetanus, the bacteria that causes tetanus, produces a toxin that is supposedly the second most toxic material on the planet. And it takes just a minute amount to make you deathly ill or to in fact kill you. So we're trying to avoid those punctures. If you do get injured on the job, so it doesn't matter how fast you're going, you may save a little time, but generally speaking, one injury or serious accident is going to cause major impacts to the schedule that wouldn't have resulted if you had been moving at a more deliberate pace. Storing materials. So damaged and lost materials create unnecessary waste. So you should be storing materials in a secure location to minimize theft. I don't know if you've looked at lumber prices, for example, lately, but with studs running close to $8 a piece, you know, that's if you have a pile of studs or you see them laying around, that's like Abe Lincoln plus 3 Washingtons sitting there in each one. And, you know, they're an attractive item that people can use. They're hard to identify specifically to a job site. So you do need to protect those things. Materials are supposed to be stored from bad weather anyway. Pressure treated lumber, for example, is supposed to be covered. That's a stormwater regulation. They don't want the rain leaching the preservative out into the water where it could cause some contamination. The preservatives that they use, almost all of them, are carcinogenic to some degree or another. So they do not want that to get into the rivers or streams. You should be locating materials away from worker pathways if possible, so you don't have people tripping or trying to climb over these things. The materials should be neatly organized so you can get to them and access them in such a way that it's efficient. This is a problem on small sites because a lot of times there's not a good place necessarily to put the work. So as well as planning for safety, you should be planning for how to best store materials on site so that they don't get stolen, they don't get damaged, and they're not a hazard to people walking around the job site. Clothing or PPE. So we have appropriate, inappropriate clothing that you can wear on a job site. Should be appropriate for the work and weather conditions. They want you to avoid loose fitting or ragged clothing that could get caught or wound up in something. Your shoes or work boots is more typically what's required. Normally they want you to have something that's at least ankle high. You have a relatively thick non-slip sole, so leather soles are definitely out. You're wearing headgear where there's a chance that there might be something falling on you or flying at you. You're required to wear a hard hat of some sort, and the hard hat should be appropriate. So they do make some metal hard hats, but you probably don't want to be wearing those around any kind of electrical installation. So safety glasses, they're required. Your eyes are one of your most important tools and resources in construction. They tell you if something looks right or doesn't look right. And so that's probably the first line of defense against poor quality. The safety boots and shoes. If you think you're going to drop something on your foot or something's going to run over it, then you may need a steel-toed shoe in some environments. A particulate mask if you're in a dusty environment, although the next step up is a respirator. And if you're removing paint, for example, or asbestos, a respirator is required rather than a particulate mask because it does a better job of filtering. If you have a beard or excessive facial hair, that may be something you need to deal with because if you're wearing a respirator, it's difficult to get a good seal if you have a lot of facial hair. Hearing protection, I think the information that I keep hearing is that the average 25-year-old in construction has the hearing of a 50-year-old person that is not working in construction. So there's a lot of loud noises, backup sirens, saws, hammers, all of those things take a toll on your hearing. And unfortunately, a lot of that damage is permanent. Dust mask and respirators, we've touched on, but carpenters I know have a higher incidence of nasal cancer, which is associated, I think, with the inhalation of sawdust and other materials on the job. You do need a respirator if you're removing paint, working with asbestos, or spraying finishing materials. So these typically either very fine dust or some sort of mist. And again, your lungs, without your lungs, you're not going to live. If your lungs are damaged significantly, the quality of life is going to be pretty poor. So fall protection. So falls are a leading cause of worker fatalities in the construction industry. You don't have to fall very far to experience a significant injury, particularly if you hit your head. I think statistics are if you fall 15 feet, there's supposed to be about a 50% chance of dying. I have known people that have fallen from a very low height, 4, 5, 6 feet, hit their head on a chunk of concrete or pavement and have in fact died. So OSHA requires fall protection when you're working at heights. Normally that's above 6 feet, or a guardrail to keep you from falling off. So in this picture on the left, in the slide, that's somebody has a harness on. I think there's some better pictures elsewhere. On the right is a guardrail on some scaffolding. So normally that guardrail is supposed to be 42 inches to 45 inches high. There's supposed to be an intermediate rail halfway between the top of the guardrail and the platform that you're working off of. If you're in the air and you've got things that could be kicked off, then you're probably also going to have to provide toe boards to keep things from easing off the edge and falling on somebody where they could create a struck by hazard. Scaffolds, minimum safety factor of 4. They require daily inspection. There's a greater electrocution hazard when you're working from a scaffold, partly because you're higher up in the air and more likely to come into contact with overhead electrical lines, and partly because most of the scaffolds have metallic components that can conduct electricity. If you're working from a ladder, and if you see me on a ladder during any part of this class, please encourage me to get off. But a ladder should be rated for the weight that you're going to put on it. So most ladders have that information right on the ladder. I need a pretty big ladder because not only do you have to look at your own weight, but you have to look at the weight of the equipment that you're carrying on the ladder. So, the cheap ladders are rated for maybe 175 pounds. Ladders are rated for 225 pounds, for 300 pounds. You want to make sure that the ladder is properly set up and that it's in good condition and sturdy enough for the intended purpose. And again, if you're working around electricity, you should probably be using a fiberglass ladder. You don't want to be using an aluminum ladder because we use aluminum for electrical conductors, and it increases your hazard. So hand tools, we have all sorts of hand tools. Some are powered, some are not powered. All of these tools have components to them that can normally cause severe injury. So we've got saws and knives and chisels and punches and screwdrivers, and just a plethora of equipment. If you've ever seen somebody who's been cut with a skill saw, that's a pretty nasty looking thing. Or if you're using a jointer, I had one of my neighbors took off the ends of 4 of his fingers with a jointer when I was a kid, and that particular incident has never quite left me. But the tools should be in good shape. You should learn how to use them properly, and Again, you don't want to leave them laying around on the job site. If you're not using them, they should be someplace where somebody's not going to trip over. So the rules for hand tools, use them correctly. Be careful when starting a cut with a hand saw. So most saws that we use on American construction sites cut on the push stroke, so they're a little bit heavier. Some of the Japanese style saws are thinner. You get thinner kerf or width of the cut, and they cut on the pull stroke. Keep edged and pointed tools turned downward in case you trip and fall. You don't want to fall on the edge or the points. Shouldn't carry too many tools at one time. You shouldn't carry sharp tools in your pockets. The tools should be stored properly when you're not using. Power tools, again, there's always the potential for electrocution or getting shocked. So you're supposed to be familiar with how the tool works. Most of them come with instructions. You should read through those instructions on how they operate. Even though they're similar, many of them have their own peculiarities with regards to how they operate. There's some excellent information at the Power Tool Institute with regards to various power tools. Know the correct procedures. Should check the power cord to make sure there aren't any breaks, nicks, cuts in the insulation. If they are, the OSHA rules are you shouldn't use them. So at home, I know a lot of people, don't have the same type of oversight they do out on a construction site, but you should get into good habits and use them at home as well as when you're out on the job site. What do we got? Electrical power. A lot of times you have temporary power on a job site as opposed to permanent power. You may be using a generator out on a job site, or it may be coming from a pole. Very small amounts of electricity can cause serious injury or death. So a small circuit is a 15 amp circuit. Those are the smaller circuits in your house. Small appliance circuits are 20 amp. It normally only takes 100 to 150 milliamps to potentially cause death. And 15 amps is 15,000 milliamps. So there's plenty of power there to cause serious injury or death, even in a residential circuit. I think this is in the book. So what makes things worse is water can create an even more hazardous condition. So as a person, if you're dry, you're not a very good conductor of electricity. But I believe once you get wet, then your ability to conduct electricity goes way up. And so that's why we have the requirements for GFCIs, ground fault circuit interrupters, in bathrooms and kitchen areas where water may be present, because once you become wet, you're a much, much better conductor than if you're in a dry state. So you can receive shocks. I've been shocked numerous times out on construction sites, not particularly not unusual, doing demolition work, remodeling. Sometimes a nail has been driven into a circuit. It doesn't cause a short, so the circuit's working fine, but an alternate path has been provided for the electricity. And if you provide a ground to the electricity, it may decide to go through you. So you're never quite sure where it is. You can't see it. You normally can't smell it. You normally can't hear it, and yet it is there and it can do a lot of damage. So if you're using tools, they're supposed to be grounded or double insulated. You shouldn't be knocking the ground lug off of your 3-prong plug, for example. Circuit breakers and fuses provide some protection against shock, but it's really the GFCI, ground fault circuit interrupter, that provides the best protection. So in that little chart on this slide, you can see that at 100 to 300 milliamps, paralysis of respiratory muscles can be fatal. Severe internal and external burns. As I said, that's 100 to 300 milliamps. The maximum potential for a 15 amp circuit is 15,000 milliamps. At 10 to 20 milliamps, which is pretty low, the shock can be painful, and you may get sustained muscle contraction, which if you've wrapped your hands around a conductor and get shocked, your muscles may constrict and you may not be able to let go. And again, that's not an unusual problem. At 2 amps, and again, remember, 15 amps for a small residential circuit, you get cardiac arrest, internal organ damage, and death is probable. Typical electrical distribution box that you might see out on a job site. So with the GFCIs, it detects the current going in and the current going out, and if there's a little bit of discrepancy, it will trip. So they're typically set at 4 to 6 milliamps, which is very low. And if that much current is missing, it assumes it's been bled off and could be bled off to a person. It will open the circuit and shut it down. So all of the temporary electrical circuits on a construction site are required to be GFCI protected. The book talks about compressed air. So we use a lot of compressed air, although there seems to be a movement away from compressed air in many cases and going to battery operated types of equipment, but compressed air is still used to a large degree on many construction sites. So it's normally 80 PSI to 100 PSI. So that can be dangerous. The high pressure can cause particles to puncture the human skin. You've probably seen a movie or two where they're using compressed air to inject somebody with something. Serious damage can occur if it's directed at the eyes or ears. There may also be contaminants in the air. So there's usually some water. There can be a little oil in there, or there may be some dirt or other debris in there. And if you're shooting it at high velocity, that can cause some serious injuries also. So with the pneumatic tools, usually we have a quick disconnect connection to the tool itself from a rubber or plastic hose that's connected to a air source. Again, the rules are wear safety glasses when working with pneumatic tools. Never direct the airstream at people or yourself. I see people blowing the dust off of themselves, but that can lead to trouble. Use the quick disconnect coupling with pneumatic tools, and that's so you're not trying to unscrew or screw something together where you may have a uncontrolled stream of compressed air coming out at high pressure. Also watch the pressure that you're working with. You shouldn't exceed the pressure the tool is rated for. You could have some unfortunate results. Duction floors. So if you're working, you should be standing on a firm, solid base. It shouldn't be moving. It shouldn't be tipping. So the surface should be smooth but not slippery. Don't attempt to work over rough piles of earth or on stacks of material. Stay away from floor openings, floor edges, and excavations if possible. If you keep going up to the edge, sooner or later, you're going to go over, and then bad things can happen. Excavations. So again, there's a whole bunch of specific requirements when you are excavating or digging a trench. Shoring and bracing has to be placed where the ground is cracked or cave-in may occur. Soil is very heavy. If you become engulfed, what often happens is the soil compresses against your chest cavity and you're not able to expand your lungs, and that's what causes suffocation. If you're digging underground, there's also a underground service alert, which we will talk about in a little bit more length, but you have to notify dig alert or underground service alert 48 hours before you start digging into the soil. This applies not just to construction sites, but also to residential properties. If you want to plant a tree in your backyard, for example, or you're putting in a new sprinkler system, you should be contacting underground service alert first. In some cases, they'll tell you just go ahead, but if you don't and you damage an existing utility, you're going to be on the hook for not just the repair and any damages that are caused by the utility being broken, but if there's lost service, if you hit the fiber optic line, for example, I had a student in one of the classes, his company had to pay $250,000 for 1 day of lost fiber optic service. So it can get pretty expensive. So different types of soil pose different types of hazards. The picture there on the right, that's a trench box. And again, that is something that needs to be placed into a trench where you have vertical walls and you can't slope the walls back. And so in addition to that trench box, they're going to need a ladder because you're supposed to have a way to exit that if it's over 4 feet deep. That ladder cannot be placed outside of the box, and you're not supposed to be working outside of the box. I was working on a job with the county sewer replacement project, and they had a trench box out on the job site. A worker was in there, the worker stepped out, the trench outside the box collapsed. The worker was able to twist their upper body back into the box, but their lower portion of their body was engulfed and they had to be dug out. So you should never, ever be outside of the trench box in an unshored trench. Falling objects. So I've had people drop things on me deliberately, thinking that that was quite the prank or quite humorous. That's why on most jobs you see things like no horseplay. So you don't want to have somebody rolling a roll of roofing felt, for example, off the edge of the roof onto you. People can drop things. On a job downtown San Diego when they were building the federal courthouse, and somebody had a battery operated impact driver sitting on a ledge. It was on the 7th floor. Somebody backed into it, it fell off, narrowly missing a pedestrian. So that was a close call, but it could have been a much more significant incident. Anyway, you should be thinking when you place something or position it about what could happen if it does shift. And so things should be put down in such a way that they're not going to fall sideways or slip off or go someplace that you don't intend it to. You should be aware of overhead work and wear an approved hard hat. Handling hazardous materials. So many of the materials we use in construction are or can pose a hazard to the people using them. Most of them are somewhat toxic. So almost anything is toxic in the right amount. If you work in waterproofing, for example, most of the waterproofing materials that I'm aware of are hazardous and have warnings on them. So as a construction worker, as an employee, before you work with a new material or a particular material, you should receive something called a safety data sheet, or you should have access to a safety data sheet. They used to call these material safety data sheets, but they're now just called safety data sheets. So that sheet, and I will post an example of one in Canvas, has hazard descriptions, how to avoid hazards, what to do in case of exposure to the material, what special safety precautions you should be using. There's PPE that's required, a dust mask, safety goggles, gloves, etc. It'll tell you what those are. So many times, you get things on your skin and you have to be careful. Some things, if you go to wash immediately with water, they could be reactive with water and cause more problems. You can carry a lot of stuff home or into your car with you from transfer. So some places you need to decontaminate before you leave the job site. You may also have to get some special training to deal with that. If you're working with pressure treated lumber, there's a little tag on the end of it that has all kinds of dire warnings on it. You're not supposed to burn that material. So you can normally dump it in the trash, but you cannot legally burn it. The material in the smoke is not good for you from a breathing standpoint, irritate the eyes, cause other problems. Lifting and carrying. So most people, by the time you get to be about 40, you've injured your back in some way, shape, or form. Usually that's from improper lifting and carrying of heavy objects that are awkward and you can't use good technique. So you're supposed to stand close to the load. So it's the farther out the load is, the more torque or twisting force it's going to put on your body. You should bend your knees. They tell you to lift with your knees, your legs, and not with your back. So bend your knees, grasp the object firmly, lift by straightening your legs. So if the load is heavy or bulky, either get some equipment that will make it easier to move it, or get some help, or both. Remember, you are the first person that needs to do the evaluation, and if you think you can't do something in a safe manner, you shouldn't go ahead with that unsafe activity. Little picture here. So looks like a box, and you can see the proper technique. What you don't want to do is stand up, bend over from the waist, grab it, and try and pull it up. You put a lot more torque on your back. So once you do significant damage to your back, you may never be the same. So also trying to keep your core in good shape and keep those abdominal muscles strong is also helpful from a maintenance standpoint. Stretching can prevent muscle strain when lifting. And so we have strains and sprains, and if you have questions on that, we can talk about it. Company safety programs often include stretch training, and yoga is good for that also. So it's your body, your life. If you want it to last longer and be more enjoyable, you need to give some thought and planning to it. Fires, so there are different classes of fires. This is covered in your text. On the right-hand side of this slide, although you may not be able to see it if you're accessing this with a phone. Class A fires are ordinary combustibles. Class B are flammable liquids. Class C, electrical equipment. Class D, combustible materials. And Class K, kitchen fires. A lot of the fire extinguishers, the most common ones are like a 210 ABC, so that you can use it on a variety of fire types. If you're using the wrong type of fire extinguisher for the fire, you may make things worse or not be able to bring it under control. Also, fire extinguishers should be checked on a regular basis. Manufacturer normally has requirements for that. Typically, you're supposed to check them monthly, make sure that they're still charged. They're normally under pressure. A lot of people like to play with them. They often get stolen. So having them, keeping them, and maintaining them is always a bit of a problem. So you should know a little bit about fires and how to control them. So a fire needs oxygen, it needs fuel, and it needs heat. So if you take one of those things away, generally you won't have a fire. Again, if we're working with typical residential light commercial construction, often we're going to have combustibles out on the job site. So wood is used as fuel in many places. So it burns easily. A lot of the materials we use, solvents, lubricants, cardboard, plastics, laminates, those are all combustible, and some of the fumes from those materials when they burn is also toxic. So it's something you want to be careful of. Anyway, you want to be aware of good fire prevention practices, follow good housekeeping procedures, keep containers of flammable materials properly sealed. And if you have oily rags and combustible materials, you should be disposing of them promptly, not storing them in any large quantity. I think we already talked about use the right type of fire extinguisher for each type of fire. Certainly don't want to spray water on an electrical fire. But if you have a kitchen fire, a lot of times you just want to smother it. If you can get something over it, starve it of oxygen, it will go out. Otherwise, you need a Class K type extinguisher. First aid. Now, I don't know how many of you have had first aid training or certified, but knowledge of first aid is important. An accident victim may receive additional injury from unskilled treatment. And so usually the first thing you're supposed to do is try and figure out what the particular problem is. If somebody has a neck or a back injury and you start trying to move them, you may make it much worse. OSHA does require an approved first aid kit on a job site, and we will look at what some of those requirements are. Clean, sterilized, bandage cuts and nicks, try and keep them from getting infected. I already mentioned the tetanus shot, so they talk about maintaining current tetanus shot. And for those of you that are don't want to be vaccinated, do be aware that the tetanus shot is really a vaccination against the tetanus bacteria. They talk about construction careers, health and safety manager. So many companies employ a safety officer or may have a crew of safety folks, and their job is to visit job sites to assess working conditions, follow OSHA standards, provide training for the employees, write company health and safety policies, and you can also get a number of professional certifications through OSHA and other organizations. And there's no particular college degree required, but a lot of people do very well working as a safety officer or a safety inspector. However, generally speaking, a lot of people don't like seeing you coming, because most people could do a little better job when it comes to safety. So I will stop the share there for the moment. And I think I have a short safety video to show you. So let me see if I can find that. Share the screen again. I think this is it.
It's all about thinking and paying attention to what you're doing. Looking out for others is how we can all get home in one piece at the end of the day.
And no matter who you work for, we all need to be following the same safety rules. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next few minutes.
So let's start with what you'll be wearing. You've got to be properly dressed at the work site. At a minimum, that means hard hat, long pants, heavy-duty work boots with a non-skid sole, a shirt with sleeves, a safety vest or bright colored shirt, and eye protection. Check your hard hat to make sure that it's in good condition. If there's tears in the suspension or holes in it, you'll need a new one.
During the course of a normal workday, you may be exposed to different types of eye hazards, including flying particles, sparks, or chemical splashes. You need to be wearing eye protection at all times. That means safety glasses, goggles, a full face shield, or a combination of the three. There are lots of jobs that require you to be wearing a full face shield over your safety glasses or goggles. And if you're cutting or welding, you'll need to have special eye protection.
Hearing protection is essential to protect you from noise. If it's hard to hear a person 3 feet away without them yelling, you need hearing protection. There are 2 types of hearing protections available: earplugs and earmuffs. In some cases, you may need to wear both.
You never get used to the loud noise. If you continue to be exposed to it, it can cause permanent damage to your hearing.
You also need the right kind of work gloves. Heavy-duty gloves will protect against rough or sharp edges, abrasive surfaces, and splinters. A lot of people don't realize that wet concrete can hurt your skin. It can cause serious burns and skin irritations, so you need to wear rubber gloves when working with concrete. And also be sure that you've got rubber boots on. If your hands or any part of your skin comes into contact with wet concrete, you need to wash the area immediately. And if you're doing anything with acids, corrosives, or solvents, you really need to be wearing the right kind of gloves.
It's a good idea to remove rings or other kind of jewelry that can catch on a corner and cause an injury. And if you're wearing a chain around your neck, it needs to be under your shirt. And if you've got long hair, it needs to be up under your hard hat. Both these things, so you don't get caught in any revolving equipment.
There's a lot of heavy equipment in use on our projects, all with different hazards. Your safety vest or shirt helps make you visible to equipment operators. And no matter where you are, pay attention to your surroundings. Getting hit by a piece of equipment or a crane load is one of the leading causes of construction site fatalities.
You're required to attend weekly toolbox talks to discuss safety on the job. This toolbox talk is for you. If you have a question or a comment about safety, the toolbox talk is a great time to bring it up.
One other thing you need to be aware of is our drug and alcohol policy. It's pretty simple. We don't want you working while you're under the influence of drugs and alcohol. It's dangerous for you, and it's dangerous for everybody around you. There are times when a company might require you to take a drug or alcohol test. If you're injured or involved in some kind of accident, you will be required to take a test. It's not optional. It's on company time, and it's required.
If you test positive or refuse to take a test, you will be subject to disciplinary action, up to and including discharge.
And just so we're clear, there's no weapons of any kind permitted on the job site.
The Project Crisis and Emergency Response Plan tells you what to do if there's an emergency, such as a natural disaster, a fire, a hazardous material spill, or some other kind of incident. The people who have incident commander or emergency coordinator vests are not only there to assist in the event of a crisis, but also to help answer questions or report potential hazards, quality issues, or near misses.
Other than police or other emergency personnel, they are the only people who should be giving you directions during an emergency. Don't start doing things unless you're told by a person with one of those vests on.
All injuries need to be reported. That way we can make sure and get you all the help that you need.
Likewise, if you have a near miss, that needs to be reported so we can learn from it and keep it from happening again.
There's a lot of tasks that require you to be wearing a respirator. You've got to know the materials you're working with and make sure you have the right respirator for the job. Respirators will protect you from overexposure to dust, mist, and fumes and must be matched for the exposure. If you're not sure what type of respirator is needed for the task, have your foreman contact the safety department for assistance.
The most common respirator you will use is a dust mask. Regardless of the type of respirator you use, the mask has to have a good seal around the face. This is accomplished by being clean shaven, using both head straps and adjusting the nose piece to fit your nose. And if you're near an operation where workers are wearing respirators, you may also need to be protected.
If you're a California homeowner that pays more than $67 a month for electricity, you may qualify.
Nearly 1,000 construction workers are killed each year on the job. That's more than 3 workers every day, and about a third of those are because of falls. All of those can and should be prevented. Any place that there's a potential fall of more than 6 feet, you need to be protected. It doesn't matter if it's an opening in the floor or around the outside of a building. The most common type of fall protection is a guardrail. Guardrails need to be constructed of either wood or wire rope and have a top rail that's 42 inches off the ground, a mid rail, and a toe board. If you remove a guardrail, alternate fall protection must be used, and never leave an area unprotected for any period of time. You must reinstall the guardrail before you leave the area. If you're working at an elevation where guardrails don't provide enough protection, such as off a ladder near an open-sided floor, you also need to wear fall protection gear.
Another common form of fall protection is a personal fall arrest system. This includes a harness, a lanyard or retractable lifeline, and an attachment point. You've got to inspect your harness daily for cuts, tears, and frayed straps. Buckles, snap hooks, and safety latches all need to be looked at any time you put on a harness. If anything is broken or damaged, don't use it. Give it to your foreman so that nobody else uses it either.
To put on a fall protection harness, start by securing your waist buckle, then the chest buckle, next the 2 leg buckles, and finally, recheck everything to make sure that they're tight.
The most important part of a fall arrest system is the attachment point. A general rule of thumb is that the anchorage point must be capable of supporting twice the maximum load. Most fall protection manufacturers say that means at least 3,600 pounds. If you're not sure if the anchorage point can hold that much, ask your foreman. Always try to tie off above your head and make sure you limit your fall to no more than 6 feet.
When you're climbing a wall or column, you either need to use a retractable lifeline or utilize a double tie-off. The retractable lifeline, some people call it a yo-yo, will generally be attached to the upper part of the wall or scaffold. So all you have to do is attach it to your harness and start climbing.
And when you're done, remember to attach the lifeline to the base of the column so it will be there for the next person to use. If you don't have a retractable lifeline, then you need to use the double tie-off method. To do that, you need 2 lanyards.
If you're climbing a form using 2 lanyards, you start by tying off as high as possible with the first one. Climb until that tie-off point is waist high, then take the second lanyard and tie off again as high as you can before unhooking the one at your waist. Climb again until the tie-off point is waist high and continue the process until you reach your work area. And then reverse the process to come back down.
And finally, controlled access zones or warning lines and barricades are used to prevent people from coming near a fall hazard. You need to be using fall protection when you're inside the unprotected area.
Before you use a ladder, inspect it to make sure it doesn't have any broken rungs or cracked or split side pieces. If it does, don't use it. Take it out of service. Before you start climbing, check to make sure that the ladder is set on a sound base and the side braces are locked. And don't ever use the top 2 steps to stand on. If you're on an extension ladder, then the ladder hooks need to be properly set and the ladder has to be tied off. When you're climbing, always use both hands. Tools or materials need to be pulled up in a bucket or by a rope. It's the safest way to go up and down a ladder, and you'll always have at least one hand on the ladder. And be sure to face the rungs or steps when you're working off or climbing up or down a ladder.
There are lots of holes on a job site. They may be a few inches in diameter to several feet across. You got to make sure they're marked and covered properly. Otherwise, it's a serious safety hazard. Building a proper hole cover is only half the job. You've got to make sure it's secure, that it won't move, and that it's marked clearly.
A lot of jobs will require you to work on a scaffold.
You need to inspect it yourself. Make sure that it's on a solid footing, that it's level. And if it's more than 2 sections high, it needs to be tied off. And then the other thing that you really want to be sure of is whether the planking and supports are in good condition and the boards are secure.
And make sure guardrails are in place on any open sides and that there are cross braces. Delivering a quality project really takes a team effort. Every single part of the building is important. The quality of the concrete pour that you may be working on today impacts the quality that occurs later on, such as flooring, millwork, and equipment installation.
Just about every project that you work on is going to have a series of mock-ups constructed. There may be a 3D computer model that we'll use in our pre-installation meetings, but there will also be full-size mock-ups like this one. A wall mock-up lets us practice what we're going to build and make sure that we have all the details completely worked out.
If there's a mock-up for your part of the work, you need to review it with your supervisor to make sure you understand exactly how things are put together. Otherwise, you may end up having to tear it out and do it again. Make sure you review the drawings and manufacturer's installation guidelines with your supervisor before starting your work.
The number one problem we typically find during quality inspections is someone did not follow the manufacturer's instructions. Every product is different, and manufacturers change their installation procedures a lot. Always have a copy of their instructions available to keep you straight.
We try to cover most of this during the pre-installation meetings, and sometimes we'll even have computer-generated sequence details to show you layer by layer how things go together. Don't be shy about asking questions. We'd rather solve issues early than find a problem later.
Quality inspections are part of our normal routine. The people reviewing your work are not out to get you. They're just part of the team that's trying to prevent problems and make sure we're delivering quality construction. If you see something that doesn't appear right, tell your supervisor and let's make it right. If you've got questions about how to do something, ask the quality assurance manager assigned to the project.
Anytime that ductwork is stored on site, it needs to be kept off the floor and the ends need to be covered over. It's important that the ends are sealed, both before they're installed and then after they're in place. If we don't do that, then dirt and dust can get inside them and spread all over the building. We always wipe down the inside of ducts before they're put in place so that they are really clean.
Once we finish work in an area, we want to protect it. If you are in an area where you see work that has been covered to protect it, be extra careful. And if you see something that has gotten damaged, report it to your foreman.
Most job sites will also have a lot of trenches that we need for underground utilities or foundation. Anytime that you are working in a trench or combined excavation that's more than 5 feet deep, it has to be braced, shored, or sloped back. This includes the area between the foundation wall and earth bank. Even a large foundation excavation can become a trench once we start putting in formwork or walls.
Any excavation must be inspected every day before anyone goes into it. Do not enter a trench until a competent person has done the inspection. Most often, this will be the foreman of the team that dug the trench. Never go down into an open trench unless the excavation is properly shored, not even for a minute. Otherwise, there's the chance that if the soil gives way, you'll be buried and either be crushed or suffocate before we can dig you out. And there should always be a ladder or a ramp within 25 feet of where you're working.
It is important that you understand how to lift properly so you don't hurt your back. When you lift something, keep the load as close to your body as possible. Keep your back straight and lift with your legs. When you're carrying something heavy, don't make sudden or rapid movements, and watch out for anything that might make you suddenly have to stop or change direction. And remember to be careful when you put something down. Use your legs to lower it, not your back.
Just about everybody will use small hand tools sometime during their shift. If you're not familiar with a tool that you need to use, don't use it until you're properly trained.
The first thing to do is to really inspect the tool. Check all guards to make sure that they operate freely and don't hang up or stick. And if there's cuts, nicks, or damage to power cords, or if the grounding pin is missing on the plug, the tool needs to be taken out of service.
Electrical tools need to be grounded, double insulated. Ground fault circuit interrupters must also be provided if the tool is connected to temporary power. That includes an extension cord plugged into a permanent outlet.
And make sure that any power tool is disconnected from the outlet before you start changing attachments or making repairs.
One of the most important things to do when you're using a skill saw is to adjust the base plate to the right thickness. That way,
Do you struggle to drink enough water each and every day? Well, I'm about to introduce you to the cube that will.
you're less likely to have the saw
Sorry
stick back.
about that.
If you're using an air compressor, you need to be sure that the hose connections are secured with a clip or tie wire. Otherwise, hoses can pop off when you're not expecting it, and it's easy for someone to get hurt.
And if you're running gasoline-powered equipment, you need to be sure that you've got good ventilation, since it'll be putting out carbon monoxide, which can be really bad or even fatal in a confined area.
And don't use a specialty piece of equipment, such as a laser or powder-actuated tool, unless you've had the proper training.
And while we're talking about electrical hazards, don't ever go to an electrical panel and start tripping breakers. There may be someone on the other end of that circuit who could be injured. So don't start throwing switches unless you know exactly what you're doing.
Someone dies from a fire every 3 hours. Most of the people die as a result of inhalation of hazardous fumes from burning materials. If you're doing any kind of cutting, welding, or anything with an open flame, you need to have a hot work permit. Those permits can be found in the JE Dunn trailer.
All combustible materials must be removed within the vicinity of the work. If materials cannot be removed, they must be covered with fire blankets. A fire extinguisher must be available and a fire watch posted while you're doing the work and for a minimum of 30 minutes after you're done.
Gasoline and other flammable liquids need to be stored in approved safety cans, and the cans have to be labeled so you know what's in them. If you're fueling a piece of equipment, it's got to be turned off, and you can't be smoking while you're refueling it.
Oxygen and acetylene bottles need to be chained in an upright position away from any possible ignition source. It doesn't matter if they're full or empty, they need to be treated the same. Different gases must be separated and stored a minimum of 20 feet apart or have a 1-hour firewall separating them.
You always need to know the location of the nearest fire extinguisher and make sure that you can get to it. Otherwise, it doesn't do you much good when you need it. Check the extinguisher to see if it is charged, but don't test it by squeezing the handle. Once you start doing that, the pressure will bleed off and it won't work when you need it. If you need to use an extinguisher, remember the word pass. It stands for pull the pin, aim the nozzle, squeeze the handle, and sweep the nozzle across the base of the fire. And unless it's a really, really small fire, the very first thing you should do is let other people know there's a fire.
Water can cause all sorts of problems. What happens is that moisture can actually get into the materials, which can start mold growing. And if that happens, it's a big problem.
First, we clean it up. Then we check all the finished materials, the drywall, trim, or cabinets. We have to be sure that there's not any water damage to the underlying material.
If you see wet or damaged material, tell your foreman. Don't pretend that it's not there. Otherwise, we may end up with mold starting to grow in the building. We'd rather take out damaged material than risk a problem. The bottom line is that water on the job site is bad. Clean it up or tell your supervisor when you see water that doesn't belong. The exterior skin of a building will only function the right way if all the parts are properly installed. If you see something like torn flashing, missing or damaged building paper, or simply something that just doesn't seem right, stop your work and notify your supervisor. We need to get it fixed before it's covered up. Otherwise, it's likely to cause problems later on. Poor housekeeping is the main cause of slips and trips on projects. So the last thing to do before we head home for the day is to make sure we leave the job site as clean as possible. You're responsible for keeping your job area clean. Scrap, debris, trash, and anything else that might be a tripping hazard needs to be picked up and thrown in the trash, including anything that's on stairs, scaffolds, ramps, walkways, and all other work areas. And if you see trash in the wall cavities, ductwork, or other enclosed spaces, pick it up. Don't leave it for someone to find later.
We prohibit discrimination against any employee on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, veteran status, sexual orientation, national origin, age, disability, or handicap. We will not tolerate harassment or intimidation in any form. If you feel like you're being harassed, report it to any one of the site supervisors. If somebody is using offensive language or catcalls towards other workers or people passing by the site, that's a problem and we want to know about it. Our goal is to make sure that we all have the opportunity to succeed at work.
So that's it. That's a lot to remember.
But the most important thing is to think about what you're doing. Focus on your work, ask for help when you need it, and keep an eye out on the worker next to you so that you can both go home safe.
We're almost done here, but there's one more thing we want you to see before you go to work.
Okay, we are. I think done for
Hi,
this.
my name's Marco Carr. I'll be your host for
We're done for this particular session. So I'll be putting some more things together. There may be an additional safety video that I provide a link for in Canvas. I thank you for your time. I look forward to seeing you again. I think I have the internet problems resolved, but we will find out on Saturday. So have a good afternoon.